Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 12th chapter in the book of Romans. The 12th chapter is a turning point chapter, so the book of Romans follows the same systematic formula as the book of Ephesians, where in the book of Ephesians, the first three chapters are doctrinal, and the final three chapters are practical living, and we witness the same formula, but not quite the same balance. So the first 11 chapters of the book of Romans are theological and doctrinal, and 12 through 16 is practical, everyday living, how to to apply these ideas into practice and how to live the principles that we learn. So learning is connected to living, and we have to live what we learn. And the 11th chapter, it gives us some insight onto the attribute of divine mercy, and it's in the specific context of the Jews and Gentiles. So from chapter 1, we read Paul has a theological interest in bridging the divides, and he's the great equalizer of the Jews and the Gentiles. This formerly most Jewish of man was chosen to be the apostle of the Gentiles. And his concern is reflected, but we're going to skip the first 24 verses in our review just because we got a lot to cover. We'd like to make it the whole way through if possible and take off on the 25th verse. This marks a literary transition in the chapter where he kind of ties it all together. So earlier there's this whole analogy and metaphor. There's a few Old Testament citations and references, and then there's this metaphor of the olive tree, and such as the Gentiles are grafted into the tree. So his aim is to establish the equality, and he says some interesting things about the relationships and dynamics between these two entities. But also a lot of the verses we're going to review have words that repeat themselves in the material we're going to cover in greater detail. Verse 25, "For I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers, lest you should be wise in your own estimation, that hardening in part has come over Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in." So a mystery in the theological sense are only a mystery to those who are outside the faith, or those who within are too lazy to learn it. What was once made mysterious has been unveiled, and that is what we read of a mystery. It was hidden to prior dispensations, and Paul was entrusted to a lot. He was the steward and custodian of a lot of revelations that were in mysteries that were relevant to the dispensation we are now in. And he wants them, to think not more highly of yourself than you ought. Be not wise in your estimation. He uses those words in 12:3. We'll get to there when we get to there. But if you are wise in your own estimation, you're going to miss what he's telling you. And so lean on his wisdom, which comes from the Spirit in heaven above. And the whole reason that Israel rejected the Messiah and the early Christians was so that the fullness of the Gentiles, so that the gates could be, so their rejection was necessary for the promise of Abraham to extend beyond its borders to the Gentiles. And then he quotes Isaiah 59, 20, 21 to supplement his point. Then verse 29, "For the gifts and the callings of Elohim are not to be repented of." So he speaks of some of the gifts, the spiritual gifts that are necessary for the operation of the church in the 12th chapter. The gifts he's referring to is the privileges of special revelation, a land of milk and honey, all the gifts. And the callings Israel was called to be. We all individual Christians have a respective calling, and we all run with the call. And to be a Christian is to be living into the call. But we also all have gifts, and we should not turn back on these things. These are ours to make the most of while we have them. So the gifts are not to be squandered, and he does not, once he gives us a gift, it is ours to keep, it is ours to use, but it is not ours to abuse. "For as you also at one time disobeyed Elohim, but now that have obtained mercy through their disobedience," the you is the Gentiles, that's who he's addressing. So they were formerly estranged and rebellious from Elohim, but now they had access to his mercy. The great mystery of salvation, the great plan of salvation was open to them and their progeny. Because the Israelites, he had enough. They were a stiff-necked and hard-hearted nation, and their rejection was necessary to spread the message of salvation beyond the borders of the the children of Abraham, the biological children. For Elohim has shut them all up to disobedience in order to have mercy on all. So once more, this is the purpose and the providence behind the fact that they had resisted and rebelled and ultimately rejected, and it was so that the plan of salvation could have a wider scope than just salvation comes from the Jews to the Jew first, then the Greek, Paul makes plain in 1:16. And then he just concludes with the doxology, which speaks of the indescribable and innumerable wonders of Elohim. A doxology is an expression of praise, and this is well recited, well known. Oh, the depths of riches and wisdom and knowledge of Elohim! How unsearchable his judgments and untraceable his ways. And towards the tail end of the 12th chapter, we read that judgment belongs to him, so too does vengeance. But he's speaking of just this unknowable being, this infinite being. We are mortal, we are finite, and we have limited capacities to even observe or intuit or analyze what he is and all he do. We can never claim to, we can only scratch the surface on who he is and what he's like, but he does reveal of himself not so little that we don't have hope, but not so much that we don't have faith. So part of living by faith is living with the fact that we worship one we cannot fully understand, and that's just part of the reason that we worship him. For who has known the mind of Yahweh, or who has become his counselor? He's an omniscient being. That's the attribute of infinite or unlimited intelligence. He is wise, but wise is an understatement. So as an omniscient being, he cannot learn anything because he already knows everything there is to know. We cannot teach him. He is our counselor, and we can never presume to even advise him on how to manage his universe. So there's stuff going beyond our pale of our own world. Our own world is limited. When we speak of our own world, we think of this self-centered shell that we sort of call our lives, but he has the whole world in his hands, and we don't know the half of it, so who are we to counsel him? Or who first gave to him, and it shall be given back to him. So he owes us nothing. He does not need anything from us. He's an self-created, self-existent, self-sustaining, self-sufficient being, but he does give gifts. That's why he gave us life. That's why he gives us salvation. It's not motivated by necessity. So what we have to do with the mindfulness and the gratitude of everything that we have, including the air that we breathe, is a gift from him. We should be living sacrifices giving unto him, as we read in the first verse of the lesson we're going to cover. Because of him and through him and to him and are all, to whom be esteemed forever. Amen. So he's the all everything, the all encompassing Alpha and Omega. Of him, through him, to him, in him, all the above. We owe him the esteem and honor forever. That is the purpose of our service, not to make ourselves great, but to make him great. So the 12th chapter, first verse, this is the lesson itself. Book of Romans. I call upon you, therefore, brothers, through the mercy of Elohim, to present your bodies a living sacrifice, sacred, well-pleasing to Elohim, your reasonable worship. So he opens with an invitation and exhortation. He's inviting us to do something. He's calling us brothers. This is the term of equality and friendship, and is a term of affection by which we call our fellow Christians. But he's once more leaning on the mercy of Elohim, which he elaborated on. So there is no, strictly speaking, sharp break. This dichotomy is largely it's not completely illusory, but it's not 100% there either. But now, living sacrifices, the Jewish religion was one of dead sacrifices, animal sacrifices. We Christians, the Jewish sacrificial system is obsolete, fulfilled, and inoperative and unnecessary, but we are not absolved of the religious duty to sacrifice. We have to deny ourselves. We have to take up our cross every day. This is a living sacrifice. We have to daily die to self to live unto him, and this is our reasonable worship. So we have every reason to do this because of all he is and all that he does, and his will is Well, we read of that in the next verse. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, so that you prove what is good and well-pleasing and perfect will of Elohim. So we have two possibilities here. If we live in the world and we filter our minds with information and influence of the world, then we will be conformed to it. We will succumb to its ways. We will be stuck in its trap. This life will be all that we have. But then there's the transformation which comes from heaven, which dramatically enhances and expands life, both qualitatively and quantitatively in the ever after. And the transformation begins with the renewal. Renewal is a process, so it's not a one-time renewal. It is a daily thing. We have to renew our mind by keeping our nose in the Bibles, our knees on the floor, and our eyes in heaven. And this is what is good and well pleasing. And the will of Elohim is perfect. That means it's flawless. There's nothing we can add to. There's no possibility of improvement. So we have to conform to that and not the ways of the world, because the ways of the world are going to lead to nowhere good. We're going to be cultural cogs, but we Christians exist in the world, yet apart from the world, to reach out to a lost and fallen world and give them citizenship in heaven. And we cannot do that if we are succumbing to its sinful ways. For I say through the grace which has been given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think more highly than he should think, but to think soberly, as Elohim has given to each a measure of faith. So Paul was the recipient of grace. He was the theologian of grace. The book of Romans is sometimes referred to as the book of grace because the word appears so prolifically, both start through finish. But his message is for all in earshot, any and all, anyone reading this, and his advice is useful. If we think more highly than of ourselves than we are of inflating ourselves and doing ourselves a disservice and selling ourselves high while selling everyone else short. But this is where the virtue of humility kicks in and comes in and becomes real. And to think soberly, now sobriety is more than the mere abstinence of intoxicating substances, but it is also the clarity of mind which comes from that. So not all people who are abstaining from drugs and alcohol are sober-minded people. A lot of them still have mental problems. But that, to reduce this verse to a paraphrase of a modern sentiment, it is dangerous to think of yourself more highly than you ought, but it is equally dangerous to think of yourself less than God sees you. So we want to have a sober estimation. A lot of people think that to be humble is to be self-flagellating, self-hating, self-defeating. That's not true humility. That's the coward's way out. We're not to be walking doors. We are to turn the other cheeks. And ultimately, as the chapter closes, we learn that we cede vengeance to him. For as we have many members in one body, but all members do not have the same function. So the church is often compared by Paul to a body, most famously in 1 Corinthians 12. So he uses the same image, one body, not extensively. That's the most extensive, detailed description of that metaphor and analogy. But he does give a few things here first. So his ideal is diversity within unity, one body, but these many members all serve the same unity. So they all have different functions, but they all are service into the same singular entity, and that is the church, and the members are the people in it. So much as the body functions and flourishes because of the multitudinous parts that do all certain things, I'm going all over the place with my body right here, but you get the point. But no function. Now the ear cannot smell and the nose cannot hear, so each person has respective gifts, and one of the pastor's job is to delegate and distribute the giftedness to their respective callings in your church. So we, the many, are one body in Messiah, and members each one of another. So we the many, that means Jesus, the plurality, the totality, the universal church. There are two church. When we speak of the church, there is lowercase church, that's our local assembly. Then there is the C church, and he's using body as a body in Messiah. So we are the body of Messiah, and each one, we all exist in mutual collaborance and mutual concur. We all simultaneously function and adapt and respond to certain things in certain ways as we uniquely can. Now, having different gifts according to the grace which was given to us, if prophecy according to the proportion of faith, if serving in the serving, or he who is teaching in the teaching, or he who encourages in the encouragement, or he who is sharing in sincerity, he who is leading in diligence, and he who shows compassion joyously. So these are the gifts which are given to us by grace. Grace was not Paul's exclusive possession. We are in the dispensation of grace, and it is through his grace that every person, every single Christian, every single person, even those who aren't spiritually attuned, does have at least one spiritual gift. And it's tragic to think of how many of them go undiscovered in a lifetime. And I think throughout history, the female gender has been suppressed. I shudder to think of how much talent we lost just by, our patriarchalism, which is not necessarily the same thing it once was. But these are all to be done. So prophecy, this was preaching and proclamation. It wasn't for. It was just another word for preaching in the New Testament. They didn't have the New Testament, so what they did was they spoke from the Spirit himself, and a prophetic utterance was not necessarily a prediction. It was just a Spirit-saturated message. So that word is synonymous with preaching, and this is, usually the head pastor's chief role. But serving, now the gifts of helps, we have to help others and help ourselves in the nucleus in order to reach out and more effectively help others. Teaching, this is often an associate or assistant pastoral role, but teaching, there's Bible classes. Not preaching is teaching, but there's also not, even though preaching is one way of teaching is more broad and expansive than preaching alone. It's just this is one way of teaching right now. But there are ways to do it in community when you have people gathered. You feed back and forth. This is only a monologue. That's the only way it can be in our present context. But I'm still teaching. Encouragement is vital. Positive reinforcement does deliver results. When you are encouraging others, it means you are lifting up their spirits, and we have to endure to the end. So it's always good to have a word and a spirit of encouragement. And sharing and generosity. You can't be a grudging giver. You can't, be giving away what you have with a frown on your face. You have to be smiling and be sincere about it. Leading, this is just an elder's role. This was not necessarily limited to the chief pastor's role, but in all things diligence. Diligence is hard work. It is loyalty to the consistent regiment, and to show mercy. You cannot, you have to do it. Joy, it's almost thinkable to show mercy apart from joy, but it is sometimes begrudging when we think about it. Let love be without hypocrisy. Shrink from what is wicked. Cling to what is good. So love without hypocrisy, everything, every virtue, every practice has the corruptible potential to be hypocritical. So there is such a thing as love given for hypocrisy. It's an insincere, it's a feigned love, which is really self-love. It's just to manipulate others to your own advantage by pretending to love them. So that would be hypocritical love. But wicked leads nowhere good, leads to nothing to trouble, leads to sin, leads to temptation, leads to death. Stay away from it. Cling to what is good. So positive reinforcements and remaining attached to the positive is necessary and vital to sustain oneself spiritually in the marathon to salvation. In brotherly love, tenderly loving towards one another, in appreciation, giving preference to each other, not idle in duty, ardent in spirit, serving the master, rejoicing in the hope, enduring under pressure, continuing steadfastly in prayer, imparting to the needs of the saints, pursuing kindness towards strangers. So this is how we are to do it, with brotherly love. That means we love the stranger just as if they were our own brother. They are equal, and we have to treat the outsiders like they are brothers in order to make them call us brothers. So loving tenderly towards one another. This is just you're reflecting the mercy of Elohim when we love Him. That it expands our capacities to love others. And giving preference to each other. That does not mean be partial towards one another. Don't give more to the rich man because you can get more out of him than you would to the poor man. But in all things be diligent, idle. He who is idle is a companion to a great destroyer. Proverbs 18:9. And the plague of laziness subsumed the early church at Thessalonica. Paul addresses idleness in that book. But be ardent in spirit. That means meaning what you do, doing it with just doing it with sincerity and integrity and for the right reasons and with the right spirit. And it's all about Him. It's not about us. Everything we do is in service to Him. We are disciples. He is the master. So we who lead paradoxically serve. But always rejoicing in the hope. Put on the helmet of salvation whenever life gets you down. The hope of salvation will enable us to endure under persecution, tribulation, pain, suffering, agony, loneliness, et al., etc. As long as we maintain the hope, then we have a vision to endure. 2. And continually steadfastly in prayer, we are to be prayer when times are good, pray when times are bad. I think a lot of the times the most meaningful prayers are the ones that are a struggle, because it forces you out of your comfort zone. And I think that personally, when I don't feel like praying, I've had some of my best prayers done, because it's really been a struggle to get out the right words. But through the process, I never leave a prayer feeling worse than I did when I come into it. And prayer is the one thing I don't do enough, honestly. But we exist, to provide for the welfare and the temporal survival of others. There are needy people in the saintly communities. A lot of poor Christians make the best Christians, but they still have needs that we must accommodate, we who are more financially fortunate. But, loving strangers, this all ties into brotherly love. We have to extend the initiative. So God loved us first, then we respond to His love by loving Him back, and then we love others, and then they can see the witness of Elohim, who is invisible but lives in the love that exudes from those who, the saints, as we read in 1 John 4:12. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. So blessing and do not curse, that makes sense. This is positive living. So if you have a positive outlook, you can expect a positive outcome. But the challenge comes is when we are being persecuted. That is a cursing and an affliction and an affront and an offense and an excessive, unnecessary, and impious one. But we still have to bless. And that is with a challenge. This is reflective of the teaching of the Beatitudes, or Matthew 5:44. Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. So this demands the virtue of empathy. Empathy is the ability to accurately imagine the thinking and feelings of others. It is a sixth sense almost. So man is a self-centered creature, but we Christians are called out of our shells of self to enter into the pains and the joys of others. Fair weather, foul weather, will be there with you no matter where you are. And this requires empathy, which is not a natural trait, but can come through supernatural submission to the supernatural. Be of the same mind towards one another. Do not be proud in mind, but go along with the lowly. Do not be wise in your estimation. So the unity, again, is his chief concern. Diversity can exist within unity, but unity is paramount. We have to discipline the diversity by being of the same mind. We all going to be gathered for the same cause, same purpose, and be of the same mind towards one another. That means loving, generous, everything we would want to be to ourselves, to others, essentially, is the only way it can work. And pride leads to nowhere good. It leads to contention. It leads to jealousy. It leads to conspiracies. It leads to backbiting. It leads to gossip. It just leads nowhere good. So get rid of pride. Do not inflate yourself, but rather associate yourself with the humble and the lowly, because by the proxy of their presence, you too can be made into a more humble vessel, which is better for the stable equilibrium of the collective. And again, he says, do not be wise in your estimation. We read that somewhere in the 25th verse of the 11th chapter. So once more that repeats, and the answer for why is self-evident and obvious. Repay no one evil for evil. Respect what is right in the sight of all men. So the first of these sentences, repay no one evil for evil. Evil is visited upon evildoers. This is the system of justice as it was understood by the ancients. If you inflicted injury or offense or loss or damage, then the same all the aforementioned would be visited upon you in equal proportion. But the Christian transcends the first off, the lex talionis, the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth standard, was introduced to prevent vengeance, because it's established an objective standard according to which no one could go above and beyond to such an extent that it would be excessively vengeful. But vengeance ties into the tail end of the chapter. But just respect what is right in the sight of all men. That means respect what is theirs, and also respect what is right. Positive influences, respect people who talk respectfully, and even respect people who, don't respect people who aren't respectful, but still show them respect in the sight of all men. If possible on your part, be at peace with all men. So this does not call us to absolute and unconditional peace. It says that we are to be peaceful in as much as it is possible or practical. So there are certain extreme scenarios and hypothetical situations where it would be impossible to be at peace with certain people in certain places. But if possible, so the if is the key. So we have to be peacemakers, and if there is the potential for conflict, we got to get away from there, and that's how we remain possible to be at peace. So we waging peace is more challenging than waging war. War is the easy way out. It's easy to seek vengeance, but far easier to forsake it and surrender it in faith to the one whose vengeance we trust and whose justice is better than our own. Beloved, do not revenge yourself, but give place to the wrath, for it has been written, vengeance is mine, I shall repay, says Yahweh. That is recorded in Deuteronomy, the 30, some chapter after the 30s. But vengeance is mine, that means it is his possession, it is his to give out to whom he wills, just like mercy and wrath are his. We read we didn't really cover that part. But he quotes Exodus where he says, I will have mercy on mercy and wrath in whom he has wrath. But before the citation, he's telling the beloved, the Christians, the brothers, don't concern yourself with vengeance, but don't let the wrath subsume you, but let it pass, let it slide in surrender, in faith. So we want to be hands-on people. We want to be masters of our own situation, control freaks who want to make sure that justice comes, but it's actually harder in a leap of faith to trust Yahweh to be the judge. Instead, if your enemy hungers, feed him. If he thirsts, gives him a drink. For in so doing, you shall heap coals of fire on his head. This is a citation of Proverbs, the 25th chapter, And there's actually 2 verses in the 24th and the 25th that speak of. So a lot of people think that the concept of loving your enemies is a uniquely New Testament. That's not true. It's communicated in the book of Job and in Proverbs and other places in the Old Testament. You know, we see the story of David and Saul. Saul was his enemy, but David loved him as his anointed. But here, what he's communicating is that it's easier to, go the counterintuitive. Don't have the mindset of an enemy, but treat him like as a friend. And if he accepts your drink and betrays that trust, then he is inviting violent retribution on himself. Yahweh, who sees all, will see your act of faith and trust. 21st and final verse: do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So this cosmic struggle between good and evil, it has only one possible outcome. There's no compromise, there's no middle ground, there's no gray area. We can either be overcome, or we can either be overcame, or we can overcome, and we can become more than overcomers of evil. But evil cannot be defeated by the devices that it employs. It can only be the fire of hatred can only be extinguished with the water of love, and so too is evil and good. And we'd like to say more, but we're just out of time. So that's all the time we have for right now. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye bye.